The smell of old paper is the smell of my life. It's a dry, slightly sweet scent of lignin decay, of history breathing its last, quiet breaths. In my workshop, surrounded by maps centuries older than the country I live in, that smell is my sanctuary. It's the scent of peace, of a promise kept. My name is Frank, to the world, and more importantly, to my daughter Amelia. I'm a restorer of antique cartography. A quiet man in his late 50s, a widower who finds solace in the delicate work of mending the past. My hands, which most people see as steady and precise with a surgeon's scalpel cutting away damaged vellum, are the hands of a grandfather. Harmless. Amelia is my world. She is the living, breathing legacy of my wife, Eleanor. The reason I traded a world of shadows for this quiet life in a Boston brownstone. When Eleanor was dying, she made me promise. No more, Frank, she'd whispered, her hand frail in mine. Just be a father. Just be him. And for 10 years, I have been. Her husband, Silken Vengeance, is perfect. That's the problem. He's a walking, talking prospectus from a blue-chip investment firm. Yale pedigree, a smile that could disarm a Senate committee, and a portfolio that was growing with predatory speed. He came from old money. He said, though the Vances of Greenwich were a name, even my old circles had never flagged. He adored Amelia, and she him. Everyone saw a fairy tale. I saw a forgery. A brilliant one, mind you. The paper was right. The ink aged perfectly. The cartouche was flawless. But an expert knows. You look for the tell. The tiny, almost imperceptible hesitation in the artist's hand. The microscopic fiber that doesn't belong. With Julian, the tell was his perfection. It was too complete. Too clean. People aren't that clean. This morning, the security camera in Amelia's living room had been on the fritz. She'd mentioned it offhand last week, worried about a string of minor break-ins in their pristine suburban neighborhood. I told her I knew a guy. I didn't say the guy was Marcus, a ghost who'd been my eyes and ears for 2 decades, a man who could pull a digital ghost out of a dead hard drive. I called him, gave him the access codes, and asked him to patch the feed remotely. Simple. Then I got absorbed in a 17th century map of the North Atlantic, chasing the ghost of a sea serpent inked into the parchment. And I forgot. I forgot to call Amelia and tell her the camera was live again. A simple, domestic oversight. The kind of thing a quiet, harmless old man does. It's just past 9 in the evening. The light from my task lamp pools onto the map, illuminating the faded coastlines. A good day's work. I lean back, stretching my stiff back, and decide to check Marcus's work before I shut down for the night. I open the secure browser on my laptop, type in the encrypted address, and enter the password. The feed flickers to life. The living room is empty. A soft, warm light from a floor lamp illuminates the space. It's a beautiful room, decorated with Amelia's impeccable taste. For a moment, I just watched the silent scene, a father checking in on his child's peaceful home. Then, Julian walks into the frame. He's not dressed for an evening at home. He's in a dark, form-fitting athletic shirt and pants. He moves with an unnerving economy of motion. There's no wasted energy. My blood doesn't run cold. It stops. It simply ceases to move. He walks to the large Persian rug at the base of the grand staircase. He kneels, his movements fluid, and adjusts its position, pulling it back from the bottom step by maybe 2 inches. Then he stands, walks to the bottom step, and looks down at the small patch of polished hardwood floor he's just exposed. He takes a small cloth from his pocket, something silky, and buffs the spot until it gleams under the lamplight. He stares at the spot. Then his eyes lift, slowly, up the length of the staircase. He's calculating. I recognize the look. I've seen on the faces of demolition experts before a blast, on surgeons before the first cut. It is the look of a man eliminating variables. He turns his head and looks directly at the camera. He doesn't see me. He sees a piece of hardware on the wall. He holds the gaze for a second, his expression utterly blank. A marble statue. Then, he turns and walks out of the frame. The quiet, harmless old man in the Boston brownstone vanishes. The air in my workshop turns to ice. My mind is no longer a restorer's, patient and meticulous. It becomes a machine of cold, brutal logic. The rug. A friction surface. It's been moved to expose the low-friction wood. The polish. It increases the slip coefficient. The stairs. The point of kinetic energy generation. The target. Amelia. It's a stage. A meticulously prepared kill zone designed to look like a domestic accident. A fall. A tragic slip. My hand is already moving, my phone in my grip. I dial Amelia's number. My thumb hovers over the call button. Don't, a voice inside me screams. If he hears her phone, he'll know she's been warned. He'll adapt. He'll find another way. A accident. A fire. My breath catches in my throat. I can't call. I can't warn her. I am paralyzed, a spectator to the murder of my own child, happening in real time, 60 miles away. My eyes are glued to the screen. The empty room. The perfectly polished spot of floor. The silent, waiting staircase. Every second stretches into an eternity. My heart is a stone in my chest. I look at the digital clock at the bottom of my computer screen. 9:17 p.m. 1 minute passes. Then 5. Then 10. The silence is a physical weight, crushing me. Where is she? Is she upstairs? Is he with her? Is he coaxing her toward the stairs? My mind is a maelstrom of horrific possibilities. At 9:32 p.m., 15 minutes after Julian left the frame, my phone buzzes, vibrating violently against the antique wood of my desk. I look down. The screen glows with a name. Julian. My hand is perfectly steady as I lift the phone to my ear. I press the button. I say nothing. A sound comes through the speaker. A shocked, guttural sobi. It's a masterful performance. The sound of a man whose world has just shattered. Frank? Oh God, Frank. His voice is a wreck, torn apart by perfectly modulated grief. It's Amelia. God. She fell. She fell down the stairs. The ambulance is on its way. But she's... Frank, it's bad. It's so bad. I remain silent. I listen to his manufactured anguish, to the carefully crafted panic. And in that silence, as my daughter lay bleeding 60 miles away, the map restore died. And the man I had promised my wife I would bury forever began to breathe again. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and fear. It's a universal scent, the same in a field tent in Bogota as it is in the pristine corridors of Massachusetts General. It's the smell of things going wrong. I wore the mask of a grieving father. It wasn't hard. The grief was real, a white-hot iron in my gut. The mask was the control, the absolute, ironclad containment of the rage that was threatening to consume me. The old training kicked in, a series of switches flipping in my mind. Compartmentalize. Observe. Analyze. Act. Amelia was in the ICU. The doctors used clipped, sterile words. Severe cranial trauma. Subdural hematoma. Medically induced coma. They were giving her a chance, they said. A flicker of hope in a storm of clinical despair. I listened, nodded, asked the right questions. The questions of a terrified father. Inside, I was recording every word, every subtle hesitation. Julian was a masterpiece. He was slumped in a chair in the waiting room, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He looked up when I approached, his eyes red-rimmed and bloodshot. A feat of method acting. He must have used menthol or held his breath. Frank, he choked out, rising to embrace me. His arms felt like snakes. I returned the hug, my hand resting for a moment on his back, feeling the rhythm of his breathing. It was too steady. The tremors in his body were localized to his shoulders and arms. His core was calm. He was performing. The police were here, he whispered, pulling away. They asked questions. I told them everything. We were arguing, something stupid, about a vacation. She ran upstairs. She was so angry. I heard a noise. He broke down again, burying his face in his hands. A perfect narrative. A domestic squabble. A moment of tragic, unthinking anger. Plausible. Simple. Untraceable. He'd seeded the story with the police, establishing himself as the heartbroken husband, not the primary suspect. He was good. Better than I'd thought. 2 detectives approached me. They were polite, somber. Detective Miller, a man in his 50s with tired eyes, and Detective Sanchez, younger, sharper, more observant. "Mr. Hayes, we are so sorry for what's happened," Miller began. I nodded, my voice a dry rasp. "How is this possible? Just a fall." "It happens more than you'd think," Sanchez said, her eyes studying my face. The angle, the way she landed. "Did Amelia have any history of dizziness?" "Fainting? No, nothing," I said. "She was perfectly healthy." "Her husband mentioned they had an argument," Miller added gently. "Was that common?" I hesitated for a fraction of a second. The perfect beat for a father trying to protect his daughter's privacy. "They were married," I said. "All couples argue. But they adored each other." My eyes met Julian's across the room. I gave him a look of shared sorrow. He returned it with a grateful, broken nod. The detective saw it. They saw two men united in grief. The investigation was already over. A box was ticked. Case closed as a tragic accident. They left, giving me their cards. I sat next to Julian, a silent, comforting presence. I let him talk. He spun a web of memories, of their first date, of his proposal, of the future they were supposed to have. Every word was a lie, polished and presented as truth. I listened, absorbing the details of the fiction he was constructing. It was important to understand the architecture of his lies before I began to dismantle them. Hours bled into one another. Nurses came and went. The rhythmic beep of the machines connected to my daughter became the soundtrack to my cold fury. Late that night, Julian went to get coffee. The moment he was gone, I walked to the nurse's station. I spoke to the charge nurse, an older woman with kind but weary eyes. I was the distraught father again, needing to understand. The paramedics, I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Did they say anything about when they arrived? How they found her? She gave me a sympathetic look. The report said the husband, Mr. Vance, was administering CPR when they arrived. He did everything right, they said. Kept the blood flowing to her brain until they could take over. Of course, he did. He knew the protocols. He knew that performing CPR would not only make him look like a hero, but would also potentially contaminate the scene with his own DNA, explaining its presence on her body if anyone ever looked closely. It was a brilliant final touch. I thanked her and returned to my vigil. When Julian came back, he handed me a cup of coffee. "We have to be strong for her, Frank," he said, his voice earnest. I looked at him, into his clear, concerned eyes. I saw the predator behind the mask. He thought he'd won. He thought the game was over. He had no idea that I was a grandmaster, and he had just made his first move on a board he couldn't even see. "I know, son," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I know." He believed it. He believed every bit of it. That's the funny thing about men like Julian. Their arrogance is a blindfold. They build their perfect little traps, never once imagining that they might be the ones caught in a much larger, much more patient design. I drank the coffee. It tasted like ashes. The promise I made to Eleanor was broken. Now, there was only one promise left to keep. An older one. The one I made to myself a long, long time ago. No one touches my family. No one. My brownstone felt like a tomb when I finally returned, the scent of old paper and ink now feeling like a mockery of the life I'd pretended to have. Sleep was an indulgence I couldn't afford. My mind was already a blueprint of action, a complex, multi-layered strategy taking shape. But first, I needed my tools. Not the scalpels and brushes on my workbench, but the ones I hadn't touched in a decade. There's a false wall behind a shelf of 18th century geographical surveys in my study. It opens not with a button or a trick book, but with a specific sequence of pressure applied to the corners of the bookshelf itself. A safecracker's trick. Inside, the space is small, lead-lined, and cold. It held a single piece of equipment, a heavily encrypted satellite phone, its battery kept on a permanent trickle charge. I powered it on. It took a moment to acquire a signal, bouncing its connection through a series of Go servers I'd set up years ago. It had only one number in its memory. Marcus answered on the first tone. No greeting, just a quiet, expectant silence. "It's me," I said. My voice sounded different on this line. Colder, stripped of all artifice. "I know." His voice came back, a dry rustle of static and code. "I've been monitoring the hospital's network since the ambulance was dispatched. I assumed you'd be calling. How is she?" "She's alive. For now." I didn't waste time on emotion. Marcus didn't deal in emotion. He dealt in data. The camera in her living room. I need the full, uncompressed recording from the server. Everything from 8 p.m. onwards. I don't want a local loop. I want the raw data packet stream you pulled. Already isolated and secured in a level 5 encrypted vault. What do you see, Frank? I see premeditation. I said, my eyes fixed on the darkness outside my window. But I don't see the act itself. It's not enough for a conviction. It's just a man moving a rug. So, the law isn't the path we're taking, Marcus stated. It wasn't a question. The law is a tool for civilized people. We're dealing with something else. I need you to build me a profile. Julian Vance. I want everything. I want his real financial history, not the curated fiction he shows the world. I want every social media post he's ever deleted, every email he's ever sent. I want to know who his parents really were, where his supposed old money came from. I want to know if he's ever changed his name. Dig into his time at Yale. Girlfriends, associates, rivals. Find the cracks, Marcus. I know they're there. There was a pause, and I could practically hear the click of his keyboard, his mind already sifting through terabytes of data. This is a deep dive, a full burn protocol. It will leave a digital footprint. A faint one, but it'll be there. Burn it all. I commanded. Use the old protocols. Category Alpha. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. We hadn't used that designation in over 12 years. It meant no limits, no rules, no budget. It meant the objective was to be achieved by any means necessary, and the operational trail was to be wiped from existence. Alpha, he confirmed. His voice was different now. The rustle was gone, replaced by the sharp, clear tone of the professional he truly was. I'll need 24 hours to give you a preliminary architecture. Good. I walked over to the fireplace, where a picture of Eleanor sat on the mantel. She was smiling, the sun in her eyes. One more thing, Marcus. I need a ghost. A new identity. A financial investor from an offshore entity. Untraceable, impeccable, and very, very hungry. He needs to exist by morning. Consider done, Marcus said. Frank, I'm sorry about Amelia. Don't be sorry, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Be thorough. I ended the call. The silence of the room settled back around me, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the calm of a workshop, yes, but not one for restoring maps. It was the calm of a place where weapons are being calibrated. I looked at Eleanor's picture, at her loving smile. I'm sorry, my love, I whispered to the photograph. I broke my promise. I have to go back, but I'm doing it to keep the most important one. I'm going to save our little girl. Her smiling eyes seemed to understand. Or maybe that's just what I needed to believe. I turned away from the picture and walked back to my desk. I had a long night ahead of me. I had to reread every financial report Julian's firm had ever published. I wasn't looking for fraud. I was looking for something much more useful, a structural weakness. A single load-bearing wall that, if removed, would bring the entire palace of lies crashing down. Julian Vance thought he was a predator. He was about to learn what it felt like to be prey. He had built his world on a foundation of meticulously crafted falsehoods. And I, the humble restorer, was an expert in finding the truth hidden beneath the surface. And once found, I would not restore it. I would erase it. The next 24 hours were a blur of caffeine and controlled chaos. I maintained my vigil at the hospital, playing the part of the devoted father, holding Amelia's limp hand, whispering words of encouragement to her still form. I'd sit for hours by her bedside, the rhythmic pulse of the machines a metronome counting down to my retribution. Julian would come and go, bringing me food I wouldn't eat, offering words of comfort that felt like acid. He was confident, secure in his deception. He saw my grief as a shield for himself. But in the stolen hours of the night, my quiet brownstone became a war room. The preliminary file from Marcus arrived at 3 a.m., a single, hyper-encrypted data burst that blossomed into a spiderweb of information on my screen. The first crack appeared almost immediately. Julian Vance's old money was a myth, a spectacular fabrication. His father wasn't a Vance of Greenwich. He was a bookkeeper from Queens named Al Petrov. He'd embezzled a small fortune from a construction union, changed a family name, and died of a heart attack before the feds could catch up. The money had been enough to get Julian into the right prep schools, to build the facade of generational wealth, but it was finite. And according to Marcus's deep dive into hidden ledgers and offshore accounts, it was almost gone. Julian was leveraged to the hilt. He wasn't just maintaining a lifestyle, he was running from a financial avalanche. Amelia's trust fund, the one Eleanor had set up for her, wasn't just a bonus. It was his salvation, a $30 million lifeline he would gain full control of in the event of her death. The motive was no longer abstract. It was a number, stark and ugly. But Marcus had found more. He'd found another ghost. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. She was Julian's girlfriend at Yale, a bright, ambitious art history major. During their senior year, they went on a hiking trip in the Berkshires. Sarah had a fall, a terrible accident. She survived, but with a traumatic brain injury that left her with permanent memory loss and cognitive deficits. She remembered nothing of the hike, nothing of the fall. Julian was the hero, the distraught boyfriend who carried her 2 miles to get help. There were no witnesses, no investigation, just another tragic accident. I stared at the grainy photo of a smiling college girl, her life derailed by a convenient fall. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't Julian's first attempt. It was just his first failure. And then there was the recording. Marcus had sent the full, high-definition file from the camera server. I watched it again, not as a father, but as a forensic analyst. I slowed it down, frame by frame. Julian's movements were flawless, his face a mask. But just as he turned to leave the room, for a fraction of a second, he glanced back at the polished spot on the floor. And on his lips, there was the faintest shadow of a smile. A flicker of triumphant satisfaction. It was enough for me. It was proof of his soul. But for a court of law, it was nothing. A shadow. A trick of the light. I closed the files. The legal route was a dead end. Julian had insulated himself perfectly. Any accusation I made would sound like the wild, grief-stricken rambling of a heartbroken father. He would paint me as unhinged. He would use my love for Amelia against me. So, I wouldn't use the law. I would use the rules of his world. The world of money, power, and reputation. In that world, perception is reality, and trust is the only currency that matters. I was going to make him bankrupt. I spent the next hour studying the crown jewel of Julian's portfolio, his firm's massive investment in a next-generation biotech company called Lyra Therapeutics. It was their big play, the venture that was supposed to make all the partners obscenely rich. The company was in the final stages of FDA approval for a revolutionary new Alzheimer's drug. Their stock was soaring on the promise of that approval. Marcus's data packet included everything on Lyra. Deep corporate espionage, hacked R&D reports, internal emails, personnel files. And buried deep within the clinical trial data, I found it. An anomaly. A small, statistically insignificant cluster of patients in the Phase 3 trial who had developed a severe, aggressive form of cardiac arrhythmia. The data had been massaged, the outliers explained away as comorbidities. It was legal, just on the very edge of ethical. But it was there, a seed of doubt, a whisper of a lie. That was all I needed. I didn't need to prove Julian tried to murder my daughter. I just needed to make the right people believe he was the kind of man who would do anything to hide a lie. Using the ghost identity Marcus had created, an elusive, high-risk investor from the Cayman Islands named Mr. Silk, I began to draft an email. It wasn't an accusation. It was a query, a subtle, professional inquiry. It was addressed not to the SEC or a journalist, but to a man named Hector Moreno. Moreno was a legendary corporate raider, a shark who smelled blood from miles away. He was also the man whose rival hedge fund had lost the bidding war for Lyra Therapeutics to Julian's firm. The loss had been public and humiliating for Moreno. He was a man who held a grudge. My email was a work of art. It was brief, cryptic, and full of the kind of insider jargon that would make it impossible to ignore. I didn't give him the data. I simply pointed him toward the correct chapter in the FDA submission, highlighting the patient ID numbers of the outlier cluster. I ended the email with a single, devastating sentence. Some people are asking if Vance has the stomach to carry this much risk across the finish line. I'm beginning to wonder if he's hiding the risk altogether. I hit send. I hadn't started a fire. I had simply handed a book of matches and a gallon of gasoline to a known arsonist and pointed him toward my enemy's house. Now, all I had to do was sit by my daughter's bedside, hold her hand, and wait for the flames to rise. The world of high finance moves at the speed of information, and a well-placed whisper can be more destructive than a bomb. Hector Moreno was not a man who whispered. He was a man who roared. 2 days after my anonymous email, the first tremor hit. An article appeared in a niche but highly respected financial blog known for its aggressive investigative journalism. The headline was innocuous. Questions swirl around Lyra Therapeutics Phase 3 cardiac data. The article itself was a masterpiece of innuendo. It didn't make any direct accusations. It simply asked questions. It cited anonymous sources, plural, to give the impression of a widespread concern, who were reevaluating the cardiac safety profile of Lyra's new drug. It mentioned the outlier cluster. It was enough. In the cold, unforgiving calculus of the stock market, a question is an accusation. Doubt is a death sentence. Lyra's stock, which had been on a meteoric rise, didn't fall. It plunged. It dropped 12% in the first hour of trading. I was in Amelia's hospital room when Julian got the news. I watched him take the call. His face, usually a mask of calm, confident charisma, tightened. The color drained from it. He turned his back to me, his voice a low, urgent hiss into his phone. "What do you mean a leak?" he snarled. "Who is talking? Find out who is talking." He paced the small room like a caged animal, his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. He was looking for a traitor inside his firm, someone who had betrayed him. He never once looked at the quiet, grieving old man sitting in the corner, watching him with sad, tired eyes. To him, I was furniture, a part of the scenery of his tragic little play. Over the next few days, the pressure mounted. Moreno's fingerprints were nowhere to be seen, but I could feel his influence. He was working the phones, calling in favors, spreading the poison. Other financial news outlets picked up the story. The SEC, catching the scent of blood in the water, announced a preliminary inquiry. It was a routine measure, but the announcement itself was a cannonball through the hull of Julian's ship. His partners at the firm started to distance themselves. I saw it in the way they spoke to him when they visited the hospital to offer their support. Their condolences were laced with an undercurrent of panic. Their eyes darted around, avoiding his. They were sharks, and they knew their leader was bleeding. Julian was unraveling. The cool, detached sociopath was being replaced by a cornered, paranoid man. He became short-tempered, his mask of grief slipping more and more often. Once, after a particularly brutal conference call, he slammed his phone down so hard the plastic casing cracked. He looked up, saw me watching, and his face instantly softened into a mask of apology. "I'm sorry, Frank," he said, his voice strained. "It's the stress. Work is difficult right now." "Don't worry about it, son," I said, my voice gentle. "You have enough on your plate. Just focus on Amelia." My words were meant to be comforting, but I could see in his eyes that they had the opposite effect. I had reminded him of the prize he had yet to claim. Amelia was still alive. The trust fund was still out of his reach, and his professional world was burning to the ground. He was trapped. The genius of the attack was its plausibility. To Julian, it could only be corporate sabotage, a rival trying to sink his biggest deal. It was a scenario so common in his world that he couldn't see the larger, more personal architecture of his own destruction. He was looking for an enemy in a boardroom, not a hospital waiting room. One evening, Marcus sent me a new file. It was a covert audio recording from Julian's office. His paranoia had driven him to have the room swept for bugs, and Marcus had simply piggybacked on the security team's sweep, inserting his own invisible software. I listened to Julian on the phone with his lawyer. His voice was raw, afraid. "I don't know who it is," he was yelling. "It feels personal. Someone is systematically trying to ruin me. They know exactly where to hit." There was a pause. Then his lawyer said something I couldn't hear. Julian's reply was ice cold. "No, that's not an option. We are not pulling out of the Lyra deal. If we do that, we're finished. I will not lose. I'll burn the whole goddamn market to the ground before I lose." I closed the audio file. He was right where I wanted him. His ego wouldn't let him cut his losses. He would double down. He would start moving money, hiding assets, breaking laws in his desperation to stay afloat. He was a drowning man who would pull everyone and everything down with him, and I would be there to hand him an anchor. That night, for the first time since the fall, Amelia's eyelids fluttered. A nurse called me over. I stood by her bed, my heart pounding. Her eyes opened, unfocused and hazy. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tears I didn't know I had in me streamed down my face. I gripped her hand. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here." She was back. My world was back. The fire of my rage banked, replaced by a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. The plan didn't change. If anything, her return solidified it. Julian had tried to extinguish the light of my life. Now, he would be cast into permanent darkness. His fate was sealed. He just didn't know it yet. Amelia's return was a slow, arduous dawn. She had long stretches of confusion and significant memory gaps. She remembered the argument with Julian, a vague, blurry recollection of sharp words. She remembered feeling angry, turning to go upstairs. But the fall itself was a black hole. Her last memory was the feel of the polished wood of the banister under her hand. The doctors called it post-traumatic amnesia. Julian called it a blessing. He played the role of the doting husband with renewed fervor, now that he had an audience. He read to her, brought her flowers, spoon-fed her when she struggled. He was the perfect man, nursing his beloved wife back to health. To the hospital staff, he was a saint. To Amelia, in her fragile, confused state, he was her rock. It was sickening to watch, but I said nothing. I remained the quiet, supportive father-in-law, my presence a constant, silent pressure in the background. My war was not here, in this sterile, hopeful room. It was being fought in the digital ether and the glass towers of downtown Boston. The whispers about Lyra Therapeutics had become a roar. The SEC inquiry was upgraded to a formal investigation. The stock was in free fall. Julian's firm was bleeding money and, more importantly, clients. The illusion of his Midas touch was shattered. He was no longer the golden boy of Boston finance. He was a pariah. I saw the decay in him every day. It was in the dark circles under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand as he poured a glass of water, the way he flinched every time his phone rang. He was a man besieged, fighting a war on all fronts, and he had no idea his true enemy was sitting across the room from him, calmly reading a newspaper. Through Marcus, I watched his every move. I saw the frantic shuffling of funds between accounts, the leveraging of his last remaining personal assets. He was trying to cover the massive losses from the Lyra deal to prop up the crumbling walls of his firm. He was becoming reckless, his actions born of desperation. This was the next phase of my plan. Pushing him off the cliff wasn't enough. I needed to be sure he could never crawl back out. I had Marcus create a new set of breadcrumbs. We fabricated a series of communications, all pointing to Julian's senior partner, a man named Robert Carlyle, as the source of the leak. We used old-school tradecraft, making it look like Carlyle was feeding information to Hector Moreno in exchange for a position at his rival fund. We planted a fabricated email in a temp folder on the company's server, created a falsified record of a phone call from a burner phone, and deposited a small, untraceable sum into an offshore account Carlyle didn't even know he had. It was a delicate, intricate piece of forgery, as complex as any 16th century map. Then, I arranged for the evidence to be discovered. I sent another anonymous tip, this time to Julian's head of IT security, a man I knew from Marcus's profile was fiercely loyal to Julian. The tip was simple. Carlyle is a snake. Check the server logs for last Tuesday at 2:15 a.m. The result was explosive. Julian, his mind already poisoned by paranoia, didn't need much convincing. He confronted Carlyle. I listened to the recording later. It was brutal. Accusations flew. A 30-year partnership and friendship was destroyed in 10 minutes of screaming. Carlyle was fired, escorted from the building like a common criminal, his reputation in tatters. Julian had just eliminated the only man in his firm with the experience and calm head to navigate the crisis. He had isolated himself completely. He was now the sole captain of a sinking ship, and he had just thrown his first mate overboard. The final piece of the puzzle was Amelia's trust. Julian was getting desperate. He hired a new lawyer, a shark specializing in estate law. Through Marcus's surveillance, I learned of his new strategy. He was preparing to argue that Amelia, due to her brain injury, was no longer mentally competent to manage her own affairs. He was going to petition the court to be granted full conservatorship. He was going to take everything from her while she was still alive, painting it as an act of protective love. It was his final, most despicable move, and it was the trigger for my endgame. I watched him from across the hospital room as he scrolled through his phone, a slight, smug smile on his face. He thought he'd found a loophole. He thought he had a way out. He had no idea he was reading the last page of his own story. I had already written the ending, and the final scene would take place in my home. A quiet dinner between two grieving men. 2 weeks after Amelia was discharged from the hospital, I invited Julian for dinner. She was staying with me, her recovery slow but steady. She needed quiet, and the tense atmosphere in her own home was toxic. Julian, playing the ever-understanding husband, had agreed it was for the best. "We need to talk, Julian," I'd said on the phone, my voice low and somber. "About the future. About how we can best support Amelia. Just the two of us." He agreed immediately. He likely saw it as an opportunity to secure my support for his conservatorship plan, to get the grieving father on his side. He saw me as an asset to be managed. My home was quiet when he arrived. The scent of roasting chicken filled the air. I'd opened a bottle of expensive Cabernet, one he had gifted me for my last birthday. I was setting the stage, just as he had once set his. But my stage was not for a physical death. It was for a spiritual one. We sat at my small, antique dining table. He looked exhausted, a man running on fumes and ego. The corporate war had taken its toll, but he straightened his shoulders, put on his mask of civility. "Frank, thank you for this," he began. "I know this has been hell for both of us." "It has," I agreed, pouring him a glass of wine. "But we have to look forward." We ate in near silence for a few minutes. I let the tension build. Then I put down my fork and looked at him. "I've been thinking a lot about my work recently," I said, my tone conversational. "It's a strange profession. You spend your life studying the works of masters, but also the works of forgers." Julian took a sip of wine, his eyes wary. "I imagine it takes a keen eye to spot the difference." "It does," I said. "But the best forgers are rarely caught because of their mistakes. They're caught because of their arrogance. They create something so perfect, so flawless, that it draws suspicion. True history, you see, is messy. It's full of imperfections, smudges, inconsistencies. Perfection is the real forgery." I let the words hang in the air between us. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not guilt, not yet, just recognition. "I once came across a map," I continued, my voice calm and steady as a surgeon's hand. "A supposed 16th century chart of the New World. It was a masterpiece. The parchment was perfect. The ink was chemically aged. The calligraphy was flawless. But the forger made one tiny, microscopic error. He used a pigment, a particular shade of blue for the ocean, that was impossible for the time period. The chemical formula wasn't invented for another 100 years. It was an anachronism, a detail out of time and place." I leaned forward slightly, my eyes locked on his. You could only see it if you knew exactly what to look for. To anyone else, it was a priceless piece of history. But to an expert, that one drop of blue ink unraveled the entire illusion. It told me everything I needed to know about the man who made it. That he was brilliant, that he was meticulous, and that he was a liar. The room was utterly silent. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Julian's face had gone pale. His knuckles were white where he gripped his wine glass. He wasn't looking at a grieving father-in-law anymore. He was looking at someone else, someone he didn't know. "The smartest men, Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, "they always believe their plans are perfect. They account for every variable. They move the rug. They polish the floor. They perform CPR. They create the perfect story." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. But they always miss one thing. They never account for the specialist. The one man in the world who can see that single, damning drop of blue ink. The one man who was watching. His composure finally shattered. The mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated. For the first time since I'd met him, I saw raw, undiluted, animal fear in his eyes. He understood. He didn't know how I knew. He just knew that I did. The predator had finally realized he was in a trap. "Oh, who are you?" he stammered, his voice a choked whisper. I gave him a sad, gentle smile. "I'm Amelia's father," I said, "and you have taken everything from my daughter. Now, I'm going to watch you lose everything you have." He stared at me, his mind racing, trying to find a move, an escape. But there was none. The board was set. The game was over. All that was left was the checkmate. And it was already in motion. Julian's fear was a physical thing in the room, thick and cloying. He half rose from his chair, a cornered animal looking for an escape route. "This is insane," he hissed, trying to regain some semblance of control. "You're a crazy old man. Your grief has made you delusional." "Sit down, Julian," I said. My voice was quiet, but it had the weight of command. He froze, then slowly, reluctantly, sank back into his chair. "Your mistake wasn't trying to kill my daughter," I continued, my tone as level as a mortician's slab. "Your mistake was your timing, your desperation. This war with Moreno, the SEC investigation, it's made you sloppy. You think Robert Carlyle was the leak? You think it was corporate sabotage?" I gave a small, humorless laugh. "You're a pawn in a game you don't even understand. While you were busy fighting ghosts, you started moving money. A lot of money. Trying to hide your assets before the firm collapsed. You got arrogant. You used shell corporations, cutouts, digital tumblers, all the standard tricks." I watched his eyes. He was following my words, the blood draining from his face as he realized where this was going. "But the architecture of your transactions, it has a signature, a pattern, and you got sloppy. You routed a transfer through a bank in Cyprus that is a known node for laundering money for sanctioned Russian oligarchs. A bank that has been under intense surveillance by the Treasury Department for years." He stopped breathing. "In your panic to save yourself, you tripped a wire. A big one. Not the SEC, not some corporate regulator. You got the attention of FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, the people who hunt terrorists and drug lords." I leaned back in my chair, picking up my wine glass. "Right now, as we sit here, a federal prosecutor is looking at a file with your name on it. They're not looking at you as a failed hedge fund manager. They're looking at you as a potential national security threat, an associate of enemies of the state." "You're bluffing," he whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. There was only terror. "Am I?" I took a slow sip of wine. "At 8 a.m. tomorrow, a team from the FBI is going to raid your office and your home. They're not going to be asking about Lyra Therapeutics. They're going to be asking about wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The charges they are building against you carry a mandatory minimum sentence. 25 years. No parole." I set the glass down. The sound echoed in the silent room. "You won't be tried for what you did to Amelia. The world will never know. Her name will not be dragged through the mud. You will simply disappear into the federal prison system. A financial criminal. A footnote in the business pages. Your name will be erased." He finally broke. A strangled sob escaped his lips. The alpha predator, the master of his universe, was gone. In his place was just a terrified, pathetic man who had been outplayed at every turn. "Why?" he choked out. "Why go to all this trouble?" I looked at him, my expression devoid of all emotion. "Because prison is a certainty. A trial for attempted murder is a roll of the dice. I don't gamble, especially not with my daughter's justice." I stood up from the table. "The meal is over, Julian. I suggest you go home. You have about 8 hours of freedom left. Use them wisely." He didn't move. He just sat there, staring into the abyss I had opened up before him. I walked out of the dining room, leaving him alone with the ruins of his life. The next morning, I was in my workshop, carefully cleaning a 17th century compass rose on an old Dutch map, when my phone buzzed with a news alert. Boston hedge fund manager Julian Vance arrested in sweeping federal raid. There was a picture of him being led from his office in handcuffs. The mask was gone. All that was left was the empty, terrified face of a man who had finally seen the real map of the world and understood he was nothing more than a forgotten detail in the corner. Checkmate. The weeks that followed were quiet. The storm had passed, leaving a strange, calm clarity in its wake. Silken Vengeance's name was plastered across the news, but the story was one of greed and hubris, a cautionary tale of high-finance fraud. There was no mention of a fall, no mention of Amelia beyond a passing reference as his ailing wife. I had protected her. Her trauma would not be a public spectacle. Julian, facing an ironclad federal case and the prospect of spending the rest of his life in a supermax prison, took a plea deal. He confessed to everything: the money laundering, the wire fraud, the conspiracy. He disappeared into the maw of the justice system, a ghost in a machine he could no longer control. Amelia's recovery was my sole focus. The process was slow, a painstaking restoration of a precious, damaged map. There were days of frustrating fog, where memories were elusive and words wouldn't connect. And there were days of brilliant sunshine, where I saw flashes of the daughter I knew, her quick wit, her easy laugh. We never spoke of the details of Julian's crimes. She knew he had betrayed her, that their life together had been built on a foundation of lies. The truth of his financial ruin was enough of a shock. The deeper, more monstrous truth, that he had tried to kill her, was a burden I decided she would never have to carry. My silence was the final act of protection. I sold her house, the place where the nightmare had happened. I had it emptied and scrubbed clean, erasing any lingering ghosts of her life with him. We found a new apartment for her in the city, a bright, sunny place with a small garden, filled with new furniture and new hope. Slowly, meticulously, she began to piece her life back together. She started drawing again, a passion she'd let slide during her marriage. She reconnected with old friends Julian had subtly pushed out of her life. With each passing day, she became more herself, the vibrant, intelligent woman I had raised. The shadow of Silken Vengeance grew smaller, fading like old ink exposed to the sun. I spent my days in my workshop, my hands once again dedicated to mending the past. I finished the restoration of the 17th century map of the North Atlantic, the one I'd been working on that fateful night. I carefully repaired the tears, cleaned the centuries of grime, and brought the faded colors back to life. As my hands worked, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I was a restorer again. I was mending a tear in my own world. One afternoon, Amelia came into the workshop while I was working. She stood behind me, watching me trace the delicate lines of a coastline. "You saved me, Dad," she said softly. I paused, my brush hovering over the parchment. I turned to look at her. Her eyes were clear, full of a quiet strength I hadn't seen in years. "I don't know everything that happened," she continued, "with Julian, with his company. But I know you were there. You were my anchor. You brought me back." I reached out and took her hand. "I will always be your anchor, Amelia." She squeezed my hand, a small, sad smile on her lips. "Mom will be so proud of you." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. A wave of emotion, a mix of love and sorrow, and a deep, weary ache washed over me. I simply nodded, unable to speak. We stood there in silence for a long time, the scent of old paper and history enveloping us. It was no longer the smell of a promise broken, but of a promise fulfilled. The world was not whole. It was not perfect, but it was restored. And for now, that was enough. The light is fading outside, painting the Boston sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray. The grandfather clock in the hall chimes 7 times, each note a punctuation mark in the quiet of the evening. My workshop is clean, my tools put away. The last map, the one of the North Atlantic, rests under a protective cloth, its restoration complete. My work here, in more ways than one, is done. I pour myself a small measure of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the last of the light. I walk over to the fireplace and stand before the picture of Eleanor. Her smile is the same as it has been for 10 years. Kind, knowing, loving. "Well, Eleanor," I whisper to the photograph, the glass cool in my hand. It's over. I take a sip of the whiskey. The burn is familiar, a dull warmth spreading through my chest. I broke my promise to you, I say, my voice low. The man you wanted me to bury. I had to let him out. He was the only one who could fix this. I think of Julian somewhere in a concrete cell, stripped of his name, his power, his future. I feel nothing. No triumph. No satisfaction. Just the quiet, hollow echo of a necessary act. I didn't do it for revenge. Revenge is a hot, messy emotion. This was colder, cleaner. This was a correction, a rebalancing of the scales. But I kept the other promise. I continue, my gaze fixed on her smiling eyes. The one that mattered. I protected our girl. She's safe. She's healing. She's going to be okay. A strange sort of peace settles over me. It's not the simple, clean peace I had before. It's heavier, more complex. It's the peace of a soldier after a long, brutal war. You're glad it's over, but you can never forget the cost. The part of myself I had to resurrect will never be fully buried again. It will always be there, a shadow at my side, a reminder of the things I am capable of. I am Frank Hayes, a restorer of antique maps, a quiet, harmless man in a Boston brownstone, a father who loves his daughter more than life itself. And I'm something else, a specialist, a man who sees the single drop of blue ink, a man who understands that some stains can't be cleaned, some tears can't be mended. They can only be cut away, excised with surgical precision, so that the rest of the map can be saved. I raise my glass to my wife one last time, a silent toast, to promises kept, and to the terrible price of keeping them. Then I turn and walk out of the workshop, switching off the light and closing the door behind me. The darkness envelopes the room, hiding the old maps and their silent, secret stories.